Sometimes a man's past catches up to him in ways he never expected. Sometimes that past walks through your door when you thought you'd buried it forever. Sheriff Cole Deacon was supposed to be dead. 3 weeks ago, he chased outlaw Wade Granger into a Colorado blizzard. The townspeople gave up hope. The search was called off. But today, Cole stumbles through Wade's cabin door, half-starved and bleeding, his dog Boone limping beside him. Wade has his gun ready, but he doesn't pull the trigger. Maybe it's seeing a lawman more dead than alive. Maybe it's watching Boone ignore both men and start digging frantically at the wooden floor. What the dog finds forces these enemies together. A child's toy buried under the boards. A secret neither man was ready for. But which one of them put it there 20 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Sheriff Cole Deacon had pinned his tarnished badge to his winter coat with the same careful precision he'd used for 23 years. The metal was dented from a bullet that had grazed it during a domestic dispute in '89, and the silver plating had worn thin around the edges, where his thumb habitually rubbed it when he was thinking. But it was still his badge, still carried the weight of everything he believed about right and wrong in this world. The November morning had started like any other in Clearwater, Colorado. The town sat nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges, population 2,147, according to the welcome sign that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. Most folks who lived here had been born here, raised their children here, and expected to die here. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors' middle names. Cole had been making his morning rounds when Martha Henley came running out of the First National Bank, her face white as the early snow dusting the sidewalks. "He's got a gun," she'd stammered, pointing back toward the brick building that had anchored Main Street since 1923. "That man, Wade Granger, he's robbing the bank." Wade Granger. The name hit Cole like a punch to the gut, dragging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. He'd known this day would come eventually. Men like Wade didn't just disappear, no matter how much time passed or how far they... And Cole had grown up hearing stories about Wade. Granger from the old-timers who gathered at Murphy's Diner every morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and eggs. Wade had been born right here in Clearwater, son of a mining family that could trace their roots back to the 1870s gold rush. Smart as a whip, they said, and twice as dangerous when cornered. He'd been 3 years older than Cole, which had seemed like a lifetime when they were boys, but their paths had crossed in ways that mattered 20 years ago, during the darkest chapter in Clearwater's history. The disappearance of Emma Hartwell had shaken the town to its foundation, and both Cole and Wade had been part of the search that followed. Cole as a young deputy, Wade as a tracker hired by desperate parents who'd try anything to find their little girl. The case had gone cold. Emma was never found, and somehow both men's lives had taken different turns because of it. Cole became the lawman he'd always dreamed of being, taking over as sheriff when old Ben Morrison retired. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, in a ceremony at the Methodist church, where half the town came to wish them well. For a while, life had been good, simple, the kind of life a man could build something lasting on. But Sarah had wanted children, and Cole had been afraid. Not of being a father. He'd looked forward to teaching a son to fish or walking a daughter down the aisle someday. He'd been afraid of failing another child the way he'd failed Emma Hartwell. The fear had eaten at their marriage like acid, creating silences that stretched between them until neither could bridge the gap anymore. Sarah had moved to Denver 5 years ago. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday that Cole remembered with painful clarity. Wade Granger had taken a different path entirely. After the Emma Hartwell case, he drifted into the gray areas that existed between legal and not quite legal. Smuggling, some said. Running guns or drugs or people across state lines. Nobody knew for sure, but everybody had opinions. What they did know was that Wade had developed a reputation as a man you didn't want to cross, and warrants had been issued in 3 states. but he'd never killed anyone, as far as Cole knew. Wade Granger was a thief and a smuggler, maybe, but he wasn't a killer. That distinction had mattered to Cole over the years, though he couldn't quite say why. Standing outside the bank that morning, Cole had checked his service revolver, his father's old Colt .38, passed down through 3 generations of lawmen, and thought about the strange turns life could take. Then he'd pushed through the bank's heavy doors to face whatever waited inside. The lobby was empty except for Wade, who stood at the counter with his back to the door. He was older than Cole remembered, his dark hair showing grey at the temples, but he still had the lean build of a man who'd spent his life working hard physical jobs. He wore a brown leather jacket that had seen better decades and boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. "Hello, Cole," Wade had said without turning around. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Cole had replied, though there wasn't as much heat in his voice as he'd expected. "You want to tell me what this is about?" Wade had turned then, and Cole saw something in his eyes that surprised him. Not desperation or fear, but a kind of weary resignation, like a man who'd been running for so long he'd forgotten what he was running from. "Same thing it's always been about," Wade said. "Emma Hartwell." Before Cole could ask what he meant, Wade had moved. Not toward his gun. He'd kept his hands visible the whole time, but toward the bank's back exit. Cole had followed, and the chase had begun. Through the alleys behind Main Street, past the grain elevator and the lumber yard, toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants around their little town. Wade had always been fast, and he knew the country better than anyone. But Cole had Boone with him, the German shepherd mix he'd found as a puppy 3 years ago, half-starved and shivering in a snowstorm. Boone could track anything that moved, and he was loyal in the way that only dogs could be. The chase had led up into the high country, where the aspen trees stood bare and brittle against the grey November sky. Snow had started falling around noon, light flakes at first that danced in the wind like tiny ghosts. By evening, it had turned into the kind of blizzard that could kill a man if he wasn't prepared. Cole had lost Wade's trail just after dark, when the snow was falling so hard he couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. He'd found shelter under an overhang of rock, sharing his body heat with Boone and rationing the jerky and coffee he'd grabbed from his truck before heading into the mountains. For 3 days, they'd waited for the storm to pass, living on melted snow and whatever small game Boone could catch. When the weather finally cleared, Cole had tried to find Wade's trail again. But the snow had covered everything, erasing footprints and scent alike. He'd searched for another week, checking every cabin and cave he could remember from his boyhood explorations. Nothing. Then his horse had spooked at something. A mountain lion, maybe, or just the sound of snow sliding off a pine branch. And Cole had taken a hard fall down a rocky slope. The bullet that had been meant for Wade Granger had found Cole instead, fired by some hunter who'd mistaken him for game in the poor visibility. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it had slowed him down, made him careful in ways that probably saved his life during the long trek down the mountain. He'd lost 20 pounds during those 3 weeks. His beard had grown wild and grey, and his clothes hung on him like scarecrow rags. Boone had stayed with him every step of the way, sharing whatever food they could find, keeping watch while Cole slept fitfully in whatever shelter they could manage. The townspeople had given up on them both. Cole knew that without being told. Search parties would have been organized, but the weather had been too dangerous for too long. By now, there would be talk of memorial services and replacement sheriffs. Sarah would have been notified, though Cole wasn't sure how she'd receive the news of his death, but he wasn't dead. Neither was Boone, and somehow, following instincts he couldn't quite name, Cole had found his way to Wade Granger's cabin. The place was exactly what Cole had expected, a single room built from logs that had been chinked against the mountain cold, with a stone chimney that leaked just enough smoke to warm the space without giving away the location. There were shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies, a bed built from rough lumber and covered with wool blankets, and a table where Wade probably cleaned his weapons and planned whatever jobs kept him alive out here. What Cole hadn't expected was the way Wade had looked at him when he'd stumbled through the door. Not surprise exactly, and not the kind of wariness you'd expect from a man greeting his pursuer. Something more like recognition. Like Wade had been waiting for this moment for longer than just 3 weeks. "I figured you were dead," Wade had said, lowering the rifle he'd grabbed when the door opened. "Not yet," Cole had replied. Though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Boone had sniffed around the cabin with the thorough attention he gave to any new place, cataloging scents and sounds that meant nothing to the humans but everything to him. When he'd started pawing at the floorboards near the fireplace, both men had assumed he'd caught the trail of some small animal, a mouse or squirrel that had been wintering in the cabin. But when Wade had pried up the loose board to see what had gotten the dog so excited, they'd found something else entirely, a child's toy, hand-carved from pine and painted with the kind of careful attention that spoke of love and patience. A small horse, no bigger than a man's palm, with a leather bridle and saddle that had been tooled with tiny flowers. The kind of toy a father might make for his daughter's birthday, working evenings by lamplight to get every detail just right. Both men had recognized it immediately. Emma Hartwell's horse, the toy she'd been carrying the day she disappeared 20 years ago. The last thing her parents remembered seeing in her small hands before she vanished from the harvest festival, like smoke. Cole had felt something cold settle in his stomach as he'd stared at the wooden horse. Wade had gone very still, his face carefully blank in the way of a man who'd learned to hide his thoughts from dangerous people. "You want to tell me how that got here?" Cole had asked. "Same way you'd expect," Wade had replied. "Someone buried it, that someone got a name." Wade had looked at him for a long moment, and Cole had seen something shift in his expression. Not fear, but a kind of calculation. Like a man deciding how much truth he could afford to tell. "Yeah," Wade had said finally, "but you're not going to like hearing it." Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the cabin's single window and reminding both men that they were trapped here together, at least until the weather cleared. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to red coals, casting shifting shadows on the walls that made everything look uncertain, changeable. Cole had touched his badge through his coat, feeling the familiar weight of it against his chest. 23 years of carrying that star, and he'd never felt less sure of what it meant than he did right now. Boone had curled up near the fire, his job done for the moment. But his ears were still pricked forward, alert to sounds and scents that the men couldn't detect. Whatever secrets this place held, the dog knew they weren't finished uncovering them yet. Cole picked up the wooden horse with hands that weren't entirely steady. The paint had faded over the years, but he could still make out the careful details. The flowing mane, the gentle eyes, the tiny saddle that had been crafted with more love than skill. He'd seen this toy before, held it in his hands while Emma's mother wept and begged him to find her little girl. "There's something inside," Wade said quietly. Cole turned the horse over, examining it more carefully. Sure enough, there was a hairline crack running along the horse's belly, so fine it was almost invisible. When he pressed gently, the bottom half of the toy came away in his hands like it had been designed to open. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in what had once been a piece of white cloth, was a Polaroid photograph. The image hit Cole like a physical blow. Emma Hartwell, 8 years old, with her gap-toothed smile and pigtails tied with blue ribbons. But this wasn't one of the school pictures her parents had given to the search teams. In this photo, Emma was standing in front of a wooden wall, her eyes wide with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was holding a sign, a piece of cardboard with words written in black marker, "Day 3, I want to go home." Cole's vision blurred for a moment, and he had to lean against the table to steady himself. 20 years fell away like they were nothing, and he was back in the cramped sheriff's office, staring at missing person flyers, while Emma's parents sat in the waiting room, jumping every time the phone rang. "Jesus," he whispered. Wade was looking at the photograph over his shoulder, his face grim. "She was alive for at least 3 days after she disappeared. We always thought, hell, everybody thought she'd been killed right away." Cole forced himself to study the image more carefully, looking for details that might tell them something useful. The wooden wall behind Emma looked like the inside of a cabin or barn, with gaps between the logs that were chinked with mud and moss. There was a window visible at the edge of the frame, but it was boarded up from the outside. A prison, then. Someone had kept her alive, probably hoping to collect a ransom, but no ransom demand had ever come. "I remember this case," Wade said, sinking into the cabin's single chair. "Remember it like it happened yesterday." October 15th, 1974. Emma disappeared during the Harvest Festival while her parents were watching the pie contest. One minute she was there, the next she was gone. Cole nodded, still staring at the photograph. "I was 22, brand new deputy, eager to prove myself. Sheriff Morrison put me on the case, said it would be good experience." He laughed bitterly. "Some experience." The memories came flooding back, sharp and painful after so many years of trying to forget. Emma had vanished sometime between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, during the busiest part of the festival, when half the county was crowded into the town square. There had been dozens of potential witnesses, but nobody had seen anything useful. A little girl in a blue dress had simply disappeared into thin air. The initial search had been massive. Every able-bodied man in 3 counties had volunteered, combing through the mountains and forests with bloodhounds and helicopters. Cole had worked 18-hour days, following up on every tip and rumor, no matter how far-fetched. Wade had been part of that search too, though Cole had barely known him then. Wade's reputation as a tracker was already well established, and Emma's father had hired him personally when the official search teams started coming up empty. Wade had found sign where others had found nothing: a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush, a small footprint in soft earth beside a creek, evidence that Emma had been taken north toward the high country. But the trail had gone cold after 3 days, just like the photograph suggested. No more physical evidence, no witnesses, no demands for ransom. Emma Hartwell had simply vanished, leaving behind a grieving family and a town that would never quite feel safe again. "I followed that trail for a week," Wade continued, his voice distant with memory. "Found where someone had camped with her, maybe 2 miles north of here. There were signs of a struggle, like she'd tried to run. But then nothing. It was like the earth just swallowed them both." Cole looked up from the photograph, studying Wade's face in the firelight. "You never told anyone about finding the camp?" "I tried to. Sheriff Morrison said I was making it up, trying to justify my fee. Said there was no evidence of a camp, no evidence Emma had been taken that far from town." Wade's jaw tightened. "But I know what I saw. Someone had been holding her up there, keeping her alive for reasons we never figured out. And now we know they photographed her too, documented her captivity like some kind of trophy." Cole felt sick thinking about it. Emma, alone and terrified, while someone took pictures of her fear. "The question is who? And why hide the evidence here in your cabin?" Wade was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been asking myself that same question for 3 weeks, ever since I came back here and found that loose floorboard. Someone's been in my cabin, Cole. Someone who knew exactly where to hide something they wanted found eventually. Found by who? By us. By you and me together. Think about it. What are the odds that you'd end up here in my cabin after chasing me through a blizzard? What are the odds that your dog would start digging in exactly the right spot?" Wade looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "This isn't coincidence. Someone wanted us to find this photograph. Someone wanted us to see what really happened to Emma Hartwell. The implications of that were staggering. If Wade was right, then someone had been orchestrating events from the beginning. The bank robbery that had started the chase, Wade's flight to this specific cabin, even Boone's behavior. It could all be part of some elaborate plan. But whose plan? And why now, after 20 years? Cole carefully wrapped the photograph in his handkerchief and tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to his heart. The wooden horse he placed on the table between them, its painted eyes seeming to watch their conversation with silent accusation. "Tell me about the robbery," he said. "What were you really doing at the bank?" Wade hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was leaving a message. For you, specifically. I never intended to take any money." "What kind of message?" The kind that would make you chase me up here, to this cabin. I needed you to see this place, needed you to understand what I've been living with for 20 years. Wade stood up, pacing to the window and back. I've been watching Emma's killer walk free all this time. Cole, watching him live his life like nothing happened, while her parents died of broken hearts, and you blamed yourself for not solving the case. You know who killed her? I've known for 15 years. But knowing and proving are different things. And this man, he's smart, careful. He's got the whole town believing he's something he's not. Wade stopped pacing, fixing Cole with a stare that burned with suppressed fury. He's been watching both of us, making sure we never got too close to the truth. But now he's made a mistake. Now he's given us evidence. Cole felt his pulse quicken. After all these years, the possibility of finally knowing what had happened to Emma Hartwell was almost too much to process. Who is it? But before Wade could answer, Boone lifted his head from the hearth, ears pricked toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the kind of warning he reserved for serious threats. Outside, the wind had died down. In the sudden silence, they could hear something that made both men freeze, the distant sound of snowmobiles getting closer. Company, Wade said grimly, moving to the window. And at this hour in this weather, that's not a social call. Cole joined him at the window, peering out into the darkness. Through the falling snow, he could see lights moving up the mountain trail, at least 2 machines by the sound of them. You expecting anybody? Cole asked. Nobody knows about this place except... Wade stopped, his face going pale in the moonlight. Except who? Except the man who killed Emma Hartwell. And if he's coming here now, it means he knows we found the photograph. The sound of the snowmobiles was getting closer, maybe 5 minutes away now. Wade moved quickly, grabbing supplies from around the cabin, ammunition, food, a first aid kit. There's a back way out of here, but it's dangerous in this snow. We could wait and try to talk our way out of this, or we could run. Cole looked down at the wooden horse sitting on the table, Emma's last gift to the world she'd never see again. Then he looked at Boone, who was standing by the door with his hackles raised, ready to defend them against whatever was coming. I'm tired of running from the truth, Cole said, checking his father's revolver. And I'm tired of letting Emma down. If someone's coming for us, let them come. But first, you're going to tell me everything you know about who killed that little girl. Wade nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. His name is Martin Cleary, and 20 years ago, he was your training supervisor at the sheriff's department. The words hit Cole like a punch to the chest. Martin Cleary, the man who taught him everything about being a lawman. The man who'd guided his investigation into Emma's disappearance, who'd helped him write reports and interview witnesses. The man who was now the sheriff of Clearwater County. Outside, the snowmobile engines cut out. In the sudden silence, they could hear boots crunching through snow. Coming closer. He's here, Wade whispered. Cole touched the badge under his coat one more time, thinking about justice and betrayal and the weight of truth finally coming to light. 20 years of believing in the wrong man, of carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear, but now Emma Hartwell was about to get the justice she deserved, even if it killed them both to give it to her. The footsteps outside stopped just short of the cabin door. Cole and Wade froze, listening to the silence that stretched between them and whoever waited in the darkness. Then a voice called out, familiar, warm, and utterly wrong in this place. Cole? Cole Deacon, are you in there? It's Martin Cleary. Cole felt the blood drain from his face. The voice belonged to his old supervisor, the man who'd shaped his career as a lawman. But hearing it now, in this context, made his skin crawl. Wade caught his eye and mouthed silently, "He can't know we found the photograph." Cole nodded, understanding. Whatever game they were playing now, they needed more information before they showed their hand. He moved carefully to the door, Boone padding silently beside him. "Martin," Cole called back, injecting surprise and relief into his voice. "How did you find me?" "Hell, Cole, we've been searching for you for 3 weeks. The whole county's been worried sick." The voice was closer now, just outside the door. "When we picked up Wade Granger's trail leading up here, we figured you might have followed him. Mind if we come in? It's colder than a witch's heart out here." "We," Cole exchanged another look with Wade, who had positioned himself behind the door where he wouldn't be immediately visible to whoever entered. Cole lifted the wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open. Martin Cleary stepped into the cabin, stomping snow off his boots and pulling back the hood of his parka. At 62, he was still a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. He looked exactly like what he was, a veteran lawman who'd earned his authority through decades of hard work and careful judgment. Behind him came Deputy Tom Bradshaw, a younger man Cole had trained himself 2 years ago. Tom looked nervous, his hand resting on his service weapon as he scanned the cabin's interior. "Jesus, Cole," Martin said, taking in his appearance. "You look like you've been through hell. We need to get you to a hospital." "I'm fine," Cole replied, though he knew he looked anything but. "Just tired and hungry. How did you know to look for me up here?" "We've been tracking Granger for days. Found his snowmobile about a mile down the trail. Figured he'd holed up in one of these old cabins." Martin's eyes swept the room, taking in the modest furnishings. The dying fire, the supplies scattered around. "Speaking of which, where is he?" "Wade Granger's wanted on federal charges now. Robbery, flight to avoid prosecution." "If you've been harboring him, he's not here," Cole said quickly. Too quickly, he realized as he saw suspicion flicker in Martin's eyes. "Is that so? Then how'd you end up in his cabin?" Before Cole could answer, Boone suddenly tensed, his attention focused on something near Martin's feet. The dog's nose twitched, and a low growl started in his throat. Martin looked down at the German shepherd with what might have been amusement. "Still got that mutt, I see." Always was too attached to strays. There was something in his tone that made Cole's hackles rise. A casual cruelty that he'd never noticed before, or maybe had chosen not to see. How many other signs had he missed over the years? "Boone's not a stray," Cole said evenly. "He's family." "Family." Martin repeated the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You know what your problem has always been, Cole? Too soft. Too willing to get emotionally involved with things that should stay professional." His gaze moved around the cabin again, lingering on the table where the wooden horse sat. "Like that Hartwell case 20 years ago. You never could let that one go." Cole's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. "Case like that stays with you, does it? Or do you just let it because you like carrying around guilt that isn't yours to bear?" Martin stepped closer to the table, and Cole had to resist the urge to block his path. "Some cases don't have happy endings, Cole. Some little girls just disappear, and that's the end of it. The world's a cruel place. Emma Hartwell deserved better than to just disappear. Emma Hartwell was 8 years old and curious about strangers. Natural selection, some might say." The words were spoken casually, but there was ice underneath them. "Though I suppose you'd call that uncharitable." Cole stared at his former mentor, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The callousness, the dismissal of a child's suffering, the way he'd just described Emma's murder as natural selection. This wasn't the grieving of a lawman who'd failed to solve a case. This was the contempt of a predator for his prey. Behind Martin, Deputy Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, maybe we should focus on getting Cole back to town. He needs medical attention." "All in good time, Tom." Martin picked up the wooden horse from the table, turning it over in his large hands. "Pretty little thing. Looks handmade. The kind of toy a loving parent might carve for their child." Cole's mouth went dry. Martin was studying the horse with the kind of attention that suggested familiarity. Professional interest maybe, or something darker. "Found it on the floor," Cole managed. "Must have belonged to whoever used this cabin before Granger. Must have." Martin's thumb traced the horse's painted mane, and for just a moment his expression softened into something that might have been fondness or possession. "You know, I had a daughter once. Would have, anyway. Things don't always work out the way we plan." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cole could feel Wade's tension from across the room. I could sense Boone's growing agitation as the dog picked up on the human emotions swirling around them. "I didn't know you'd been married," Cole said carefully. "I wasn't, but there was a girl. Long time ago. Sweet little thing with blonde pigtails and blue ribbons in her hair. She would have made a fine daughter if circumstances had been different. Martin's voice had taken on a dreamy quality, as if he were remembering something pleasant. Children are so trusting at that age, so willing to believe that adults have their best interests at heart. Cole felt sick. The words were wrong, loaded with implications that made his skin crawl. But worse was the realization that Martin was confessing in his own twisted way. Describing Emma Hartwell as the daughter he'd never had, speaking of her trust like something he'd exploited. "Sheriff," Deputy Bradshaw said again, more urgently this time, "we really should get moving. The weather's getting worse, and..." "The weather's fine, Tom." Martin set the wooden horse back on the table with exaggerated care. "We have time for a proper conversation. After all, Cole and I have a lot of catching up to do. 20 years' worth, you might say." He moved to the fireplace, stirring the coals with an iron poker until flames began to lick at the remaining wood. The light danced across his face, creating shadows that made his features look sharp and predatory. "You know, Cole, I've always admired your persistence. The way you kept working that Hartwell case long after everyone else had given up. Reading through the files, re-interviewing witnesses, chasing down every half-baked theory and conspiracy that came your way." Martin chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Of course, persistence can become obsession if you're not careful. And obsession can lead a man down some very dark paths. Is that a threat?" "It's advice. From someone who cares about your career, your reputation, your future." Martin's eyes met Cole's across the cabin, and the message was clear. Drop this or face the consequences. "Some secrets are better left buried, don't you think?" Cole thought about the photograph hidden in his shirt pocket, about Emma's terrified face and the signs she'd held up documenting her captivity, about 20 years of carrying guilt for a crime he hadn't committed, while the real killer walked free and even prospered. "Depends on the secret," he said finally. Martin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." From his position behind the door, Wade must have recognized the threat in those words. Cole heard the subtle sound of a rifle being readied, the quiet click of a safety being disengaged, but Martin heard it too. His hand moved to his service weapon with practiced ease, even as his expression remained conversational and calm. "Why don't you come out from behind that door, Wade?" he called pleasantly. "No point hiding anymore. We all know you're there." Wade stepped into view with his rifle lowered but ready, his movements careful and controlled. Deputy Bradshaw immediately drew his weapon, training it on Wade with hands that shook slightly in the cold, or from nerves. "Easy, Tom," Martin said calmly. "No need for dramatics. We're all friends here, aren't we?" Cole could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would be spilled in this small cabin. He needed to de-escalate, but more than that, he needed to understand exactly what Martin knew and what he was planning. "Wade's not armed," Cole said, which was technically true since the rifle was pointed at the floor. "And he's been helping me survive up here for the past few days. Without him, I'd be dead." "How noble of him," Martin replied, his tone suggesting he found the idea amusing. "A wanted fugitive playing nursemaid to a wounded lawman. There's a story for the newspapers." Wade spoke for the first time since the others had arrived, his voice steady and controlled. "I never robbed your bank, Cleary. You know that as well as I do I? The security footage shows you clear as day, demanding money from the teller." Martin's smile widened. "Though I suppose you could argue you were coerced. Blackmailed, perhaps, by someone who had information you didn't want made public." Cole felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "You forced him to rob the bank. You needed a reason to get me up here, to this cabin, did I? That's a serious accusation, Cole. You'd need evidence to support something like that." Martin's eyes drifted back to the wooden horse on the table. "Of course, evidence can be a tricky thing. Sometimes it appears when you least expect it. Sometimes it disappears just as mysteriously." The implication was clear. Martin knew about the photograph, knew they'd found it, which meant he'd been watching them somehow, or had expected them to find it eventually. Wade seemed to reach the same conclusion. "You planted it, didn't you? The horse, the picture. You put them here for us to find. Now why would I do something like that?" Martin asked innocently. "If I'd killed Emma Hartwell, the last thing I'd want would be evidence of the crime surfacing after 20 years. Unless the evidence implicates someone else," Cole said, understanding flooding through him. "Unless you're planning to frame Wade for Emma's murder." Martin's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Frame is such an ugly word, Cole. I prefer to think of it as correcting a historical oversight." From his jacket pocket, Martin produced a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a blue hair ribbon, faded but still recognizable as the kind young girls wore in their hair. Cole's blood turned to ice as he realized what he was looking at. "Emma Hartwell's ribbon," Martin said conversationally. "Found it in Wade's old truck, the one he abandoned down the mountain." "Amazing what turns up when you know where to look." Wade's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "That's impossible." You planted that? Can you prove it?" "Will anyone believe the word of a wanted fugitive over the testimony of a decorated sheriff?" Martin held the bag up to the firelight, studying it with mock interest. "Physical evidence is so much more convincing than protestations of innocence, don't you think?" Cole felt the trap closing around them. 20 years of careful planning, of positioning himself as the respected lawman while discrediting anyone who might threaten his secret. Martin had played the long game with the patience of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to tie up all the loose ends. "Why now?" Cole asked. "You got away with it for 20 years. Why risk exposing yourself?" "Because you never stopped digging, Cole. You and your noble sense of justice." Martin's tone turned bitter. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it's been, watching over your shoulder for 2 decades? Making sure you never got too close to the truth, redirecting your investigations, managing the evidence?" Cole thought back over the years, remembering cases that had stalled unexpectedly, witnesses who'd suddenly become uncooperative, evidence that had gone missing from the files. How many times had Martin subtly steered him away from uncomfortable truths? "The Hartwell file," Cole said, pieces falling into place. "You were always the one suggesting which leads to follow, which witnesses to re-interview. You've been controlling my investigation from the beginning. Someone had to. Left to your own devices, you might have actually solved the case." Martin chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Though I'll admit, you came closer than I expected a few times. That business with the festival timeline, for instance. You almost figured out that Emma hadn't been taken during the pie contest after all." Wade shifted slightly, and Cole caught the movement in his peripheral vision. The outlaw was positioning himself for something, an attack maybe, or an attempt to get to the door. But Deputy Bradshaw was watching him carefully, his weapon still trained on Wade's center mass. "Tell me what really happened," Cole said, partly to keep Martin talking and partly because he needed to know. After 20 years of guilt and wondering, he deserved the truth. Martin considered the request, then shrugged as if it didn't matter anymore. Emma was a beautiful child, curious, trusting, the kind of little girl who believed the world was full of good people who wanted to help her. His voice took on that dreamy quality again, and Cole had to suppress a shudder. "I was working security at the festival that day. She came up to me, said she was lost, asked if I could help her find her parents." The confession was delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone that it took Cole a moment to process what he was hearing. This was it, the admission he'd been seeking for 20 years, spoken like a man discussing the weather. "I told her I'd help, of course. Led her away from the crowds, said we'd have a better view from up on the hill behind the church. She trusted me completely. Why wouldn't she? I was wearing a uniform, a badge. I represented everything safe and good in her little world." Cole's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to reach for his weapon, wanted to end this confession before it went any further. But he needed to hear it all, needed to understand exactly what kind of monster had been hiding behind the badge all these years. Once we were alone, well, things progressed naturally. She was so small, so helpless. She cried, of course, but quietly. Even at 8 years old, she understood that making noise would only make things worse. Martin's eyes were distant now, lost in memory. I kept her for 3 days. Had a little hunting cabin up in the mountains, place nobody knew about. We had some lovely conversations during that time. The photograph? Cole's hand moved unconsciously to his shirt pocket, where the image of Emma's terrified face was hidden. 3 days of hell for a little girl who'd only wanted to find her parents. She was so trusting right up to the end, Martin continued. Even when I told her we were going to play a new game, she believed me. Children are remarkable that way. Their capacity for hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Wade made a sound that might have been a growl or a sob. His knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle, and Cole could see the effort it was taking him not to pull the trigger. The photographs were for posterity, Martin said, noticing Cole's gesture toward his pocket. Documentation of our time together. I always meant to destroy them, but somehow I never quite got around to it. Sentimental value, I suppose. You're sick, Wade said, the words ground out through clenched teeth. I'm human, Martin replied calmly. Humans have urges, desires that polite society chooses to ignore or condemn. I simply acted on mine. He looked directly at Cole, and the absence of remorse in his eyes was more chilling than any threat. The only mistake I made was letting that tracking dog of yours get too close to where I'd buried her. Had to improvise a bit, make it look like she'd been carried off by animals. Messy, but effective. Cole remembered the search, remembered finding scattered bones and torn fabric that the forensics team had identified as Emma's remains. He'd assumed wild animals had been responsible for the condition of the body. Another lie, another misdirection orchestrated by the man he'd trusted above all others. 20 years, Cole whispered. 20 years I've been working for the man who killed her. Working with, Martin corrected. We've been partners, Cole, a team. I provided the guidance. You provided the earnest dedication to justice that made our department look good. It was a perfect arrangement. Boone had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the conversation, pacing back and forth near Cole's feet. Now the dog suddenly stopped, his attention focused on something outside the cabin. His ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Martin noticed the dog's behavior and frowned. "What's wrong with your mutt?" Before Cole could answer, they all heard it. The distant sound of more snowmobiles approaching through the forest. Multiple engines getting closer. Deputy Bradshaw looked confused. "Sheriff, you said it was just us coming up here." Martin's expression had gone cold and calculating. "Change of plans, Tom. We're going to need more help cleaning up this mess." The sound of the engines cut out somewhere near where Martin and Bradshaw had left their own machines. In the sudden silence, they could hear voices calling through the trees, getting closer. "How many?" Wade asked quietly. "Enough," Martin replied. He drew his service weapon, a modern Glock that looked deadly efficient in his large hands. "I'm afraid this is where our reunion comes to an end, Cole. You and your friend here are going to have a tragic accident. Got lost in the blizzard, maybe fell through some thin ice. These things happen in the mountains." Cole's hand moved toward his father's revolver, but Martin was already tracking him with the Glock. "I wouldn't, if I were you. Tom, disarm them both. We need to make this look right." But Deputy Bradshaw hesitated, his young face confused and troubled. "Sheriff, I don't understand what's happening here. Why are we threatening Cole? He's one of us." "Do as you're told, Deputy," Martin snapped. "These men are dangerous criminals. They've been planning to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. But you just said," Bradshaw began. "I said a lot of things. None of which you heard clearly in all this confusion." Martin's voice carried the weight of authority and implied threat. "Isn't that right, Tom?" Cole could see the young deputy wrestling with his conscience, trying to reconcile what he'd heard with his respect for the chain of command. It was the same struggle Cole himself had faced countless times over the years, choosing to trust Martin's judgment even when his instincts said otherwise. Outside, the voices were getting closer. Whatever Martin had planned, it was about to happen. "Last chance, Cole," Martin said softly. "Hand over that photograph and maybe we can work something out. Keep fighting and you'll end up like Emma Hartwell, another unsolved disappearance that the community eventually learns to live with." Cole looked at Wade, saw the same determination in the other man's eyes that he felt in his own heart. They'd come too far and learned too much to back down now. Emma deserved justice, even if it cost them their lives. "Go to hell," Cole said, and reached for his gun. The cabin erupted into chaos. Cole's hand had barely touched his holster when Martin's Glock barked, the muzzle flash lighting up the small space like lightning. The bullet whined past Cole's ear, splintering wood from the wall behind him. Wade reacted instantly, bringing his rifle up and firing in the same fluid motion. His shot took Deputy Bradshaw in the shoulder, spinning the younger man around and sending his weapon flying across the room. Bradshaw hit the floor hard, crying out in pain and confusion. "Tom!" Martin shouted, diving for cover behind the heavy wooden table. "Tom, stay down!" Cole rolled left, using the stone fireplace as cover while he drew his father's revolver. Boone had flattened himself against the floor, ears back, instinctively seeking shelter from the violence erupting around him. "Wade!" Cole called. "The door!" But Wade was already moving, working his way toward the cabin's entrance, while keeping his rifle trained on Martin's position. They needed to get out before Martin's reinforcements arrived. But the sheriff had positioned himself between them and the only exit. Another shot from Martin's Glock sent splinters flying from the log wall near Wade's head. The man was an excellent marksman. Cole remembered that from their training sessions years ago. In the confined space of the cabin, his accuracy would be deadly. "You're only making this harder on yourselves," Martin called out. "My men will be here any minute. Surrender now and I'll make it quick." Cole risked a glance around the fireplace, assessing their tactical situation. Martin had good cover behind the table, a clear field of fire toward both the door and the window. Deputy Bradshaw was wounded but alive, curled up against the far wall and trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder. The young man's face was pale with shock and confusion. Outside, the voices were getting closer. At least 3 men, maybe more, calling out coordinates and positions as they moved through the forest. Professional movements, Cole realized. Not a rescue operation, but a tactical deployment designed to eliminate witnesses. "Cole," Wade said quietly, "there's a root cellar under the floor. Trapdoor behind the stove." Cole looked where Wade indicated and saw the outline of a wooden hatch, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. It might be their only chance of escape, but they'd have to cross Martin's line of fire to reach it. "Tom," Martin called to his wounded deputy. "Can you hear me, son? Are you all right?" Bradshaw tried to respond, but could only manage a weak groan. Blood was seeping through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder, and his face was growing paler by the minute. "You shot a good man." "Wade," Martin said, genuine anger coloring his voice for the first time. "Tom Bradshaw's got a wife and baby at home. What do you think they're going to say when they find out you killed him?" "He's not dead," Wade replied. "But he will be if he doesn't get medical attention soon." "Let us get him to a hospital and maybe we can work something out," Martin laughed bitterly. "You think I'm stupid? The moment you walk into town with Tom bleeding and stories about me confessing to murder, my career is over. My life is over." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold finality of a man who'd made his choice. "Sometimes you have to cut your losses and start fresh somewhere else." The implications of that were chilling. Martin wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to disappear, to reinvent himself somewhere else where nobody knew his history. How many other Emma Hartwells had there been over the years? How many would there be in the future if he escaped? Cole caught Wade's eye and nodded toward the trapdoor. They needed to move now, before Martin's backup arrived, and cut off all their options. But as Cole prepared to make his break for the cellar, something unexpected happened. Boone suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and padded over to where Deputy Bradshaw lay bleeding. "Get away from him!" Martin snapped, but the dog ignored him. Boone sniffed at Bradshaw's wound, then did something that made Cole's heart skip a beat. The dog began pawing at the deputy's equipment belt, specifically at a small leather pouch that Cole recognized as an evidence bag. "What's he doing?" Wade whispered. Cole watched in fascination as Boone managed to work the pouch open with his teeth, revealing something that glinted in the firelight. A brass compass, old and tarnished, with an inscription visible on its face, Martin saw it too, and his complexion went ashen. "Tom," he said urgently, "where did you get that?" Bradshaw looked down at the compass with confusion, as if seeing it for the first time. I don't know. Found it in my patrol car this morning. Figured someone had dropped it, meant to turn it in to Lost and Found." Cole's mind raced as he studied the compass. It was the kind of hiking equipment a child might carry, something given as a gift by loving parents who wanted their daughter to explore the world safely. The inscription was partially visible. "To my brave explorer." Emma's compass, Cole breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You kept it. After all these years, you kept her compass as a trophy." Martin's silence was answer enough. Wade had noticed something else. "Tom, check your pockets." "All of them." "What else did you find in your patrol car?" With his uninjured hand, Bradshaw began checking his pockets methodically. From his jacket, he produced a small plastic bag containing what looked like a child's bracelet. From his pants pocket came another bag with a lock of blonde hair. "Jesus," Bradshaw whispered, staring at the evidence. "Sheriff, what is this stuff?" "Trophies," Cole said grimly. "Souvenirs from a little girl's murder. He's been planting them on you, Tom, setting you up to take the fall when the truth comes out." The young deputy's face went through a range of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a growing anger as the implications sank in. He looked up at Martin with eyes that held a terrible understanding. "You were going to frame me," Bradshaw said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for killing a child. You were going to destroy my life, my family, everything I care about." Martin's response was to shift his aim toward the wounded deputy. "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good, Tom, nothing personal." But before Martin could pull the trigger, the cabin door exploded inward. 3 men in tactical gear burst through the entrance, weapons drawn and ready. For a split second, Cole thought they might be federal agents or state police, someone who could help them expose the truth. Then he saw the patches on their uniforms and realized his mistake. These weren't law enforcement officers. They were private security, the kind of mercenaries who could be hired to clean up inconvenient problems without asking too many questions. "Secure the scene," the lead man ordered in a professional monotone. "No survivors." Martin smiled with genuine relief. "Gentlemen, right on time. We have 2 armed and dangerous fugitives who've taken a deputy hostage. Use whatever force is necessary." Cole found himself facing the muzzles of 3 assault rifles, held by men who clearly had no interest in taking prisoners. This was an execution squad, brought in to eliminate everyone who knew the truth about Emma Hartwell's murder. But as the mercenaries prepared to fire, Deputy Bradshaw did something that surprised everyone in the room. Despite his wound, despite his pain and confusion, he rolled sideways and threw himself between the guns and Cole. "No!" he shouted. "These men are telling the truth. Sheriff Cleary confessed to murdering Emma Hartwell. I heard him." The lead mercenary hesitated, looking to Martin for clarification. "The deputy's been shot," Martin said smoothly. "He's delirious from blood loss. Proceed with the operation." But Bradshaw's intervention had given Cole and Wade the seconds they needed. Wade's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 of the mercenaries before they could react. Cole put a bullet from his father's revolver into the 3rd man's center mass, sending him crashing backward through the open door. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear more voices outside, backup for the backup, converging on the cabin from multiple directions. "Move," Wade shouted, already heading for the trapdoor behind the stove. "We're out of time!" Cole helped Bradshaw to his feet, supporting the wounded deputy's weight as they stumbled toward the cellar entrance. The young man was losing blood fast, but his eyes were clear and determined. "I'm sorry," Bradshaw said as they reached the trapdoor. "I should have known. Should have seen what he really was." "None of us saw it," Cole replied. "That's what made him so dangerous." Behind them, Martin was shouting orders to his remaining forces, coordinating their assault on the cabin. Soon they would discover the cellar entrance, and the hunt would begin in earnest. But for now they had darkness and Emma Hartwell's compass to guide them through the tunnels beneath the mountain. The truth was finally coming to light, and all of Martin Cleary's careful plans were crumbling around him. Emma would have her justice, even if they had to fight their way through hell to give it to her. The root cellar was cramped and dark, carved from the rocky soil beneath the cabin sometime in the distant past. Cole could smell decades of stored vegetables and preserves, along with the metallic scent of Tom Bradshaw's blood as they helped the wounded deputy down the rough wooden ladder. Wade closed the trapdoor above them, just as they heard boots thundering across the cabin floor. Heavy footsteps moved back and forth, accompanied by shouted orders and the crash of furniture being overturned. Martin's men were conducting a thorough search, looking for any sign of where their quarry had gone. "Flashlight in the corner," Wade whispered, pointing to a battery-powered lantern sitting on a wooden shelf. Cole grabbed it and clicked it on, keeping the beam low to avoid any light seeping through cracks in the floorboards above. The cellar was larger than Cole had expected, extending back into the hillside like a natural cave. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of supplies, canned goods, medical equipment, ammunition. Wade had clearly been using this place as more than just a hideout. "There's a tunnel," Wade explained quietly, leading them deeper into the cellar. "Connects to an old mine shaft about half a mile from here. Built it myself over the years, figured I might need a back door someday." Deputy Bradshaw was leaning heavily against Cole, his breathing shallow and labored. The bullet wound in his shoulder was still bleeding, soaking through the makeshift bandage they'd fashioned from torn fabric. "How are you holding up, Tom?" Cole asked. "Been better," Bradshaw managed, attempting a weak smile. "But I've been worse too. Remember that domestic dispute last year? Drunk guy with a baseball bat?" He winced as Cole helped him navigate around a low-hanging beam. "At least this time, I know who the real enemy is." Above them, the search was intensifying. They could hear Martin's voice directing his men, calm and professional, despite the chaos of the past few minutes. "Check every inch of this place," Martin ordered. They didn't just vanish into thin air. "And find out how badly Tom was hurt. If he's bleeding out somewhere, we need to know." Cole caught Wade's eye in the flashlight beam. The outlaw's expression was grim but determined, and Cole realized that for the first time in 20 years they were truly on the same side. Whatever differences had existed between them, whatever mistrust had built up over the decades, it had all been swept away by the truth about Emma Hartwell's murder. "Wade," Cole said quietly as they reached the entrance to the tunnel, "why did you really come back to Clearwater? After all these years of staying away, why risk exposing yourself?" Wade paused at the tunnel mouth, checking to make sure the passage was clear before answering. "Because I found something. Something that proved Martin Cleary killed Emma, and that he'd been covering it up all this time." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Even in the dim flashlight beam, Cole could see that it was some kind of official document. "Church program," Wade explained. "From the Sunday before Emma disappeared. Found it in an evidence box that was supposed to have been destroyed years ago." He handed the paper to Cole, who unfolded it carefully. The program was from the Clearwater Methodist Church, dated October 13th, 1974, 2 days before Emma's disappearance. But what made Cole's blood run cold was the handwriting in the margin. Notes about the Harvest Festival, about security arrangements, about which deputies would be working which shifts, and at the bottom, in that same careful script, "Emma H. Perfect opportunity. Festival crowd will provide cover. Parents distracted during pie contest. Dear God," Cole whispered, recognizing the handwriting. He'd seen it countless times over the years on reports and memos, had learned to read Martin Cleary's precise penmanship like a second language. "He was planning it. Planning to take her. Gets worse," Wade said grimly. "Look at the back." Cole turned the program over and felt sick. There was a rough map drawn in pencil, showing the route from the festival grounds to what was labeled as Hunting Cabin, the same cabin where Martin had admitted keeping Emma for 3 days before killing her. "Where did you find this?" "Storage facility in Denver. Place where they keep old evidence from closed cases. I've been working as a night security guard there for the past 2 years, trying to get access to files from Emma's case. Wade's voice carried a weight of exhaustion that spoke of years spent searching for the truth. Most of the boxes had been cleaned out, sanitized, but this one was misfiled, stuck behind some other cases from the same time period. Above them, the searching had stopped. Cole could hear voices, but they were muffled and distant now. "They've figured out we're not in the cabin anymore," Bradshaw said weakly. "They'll start expanding the search perimeter." Wade nodded and started moving deeper into the tunnel, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. "We need to reach the mine shaft before they think to check the old mining claims. Once we're in the network of tunnels up there, we can work our way down to the valley." The tunnel was rough-hewn, carved by hand through rock and soil. Wade had clearly spent considerable time and effort creating this escape route, reinforcing it with timber supports and keeping it free of debris. It was the work of a man who understood that survival sometimes depended on having multiple options. As they walked, Cole found himself thinking about the church program and what it represented. Not just evidence of premeditation, but proof that Martin Cleary had been planning Emma's murder for days before the festival. The casual way he'd written about her, referring to her by her initials like she was just another item on a to-do list, made Cole's stomach turn. "How many others do you think there were?" he asked Wade. "Others? Other children. Other victims. A man doesn't just wake up one day and decide to kidnap and murder an 8-year-old girl. There had to be warning signs, previous crimes." Wade was quiet for a long moment. The only sound, the shuffling of their feet on the tunnel floor and Bradshaw's labored breathing. "I've been wondering the same thing," Wade finally admitted. "Spent the last 2 years going through cold case files from all over Colorado and the surrounding states. Found some patterns that made me sick to think about." "What kind of patterns?" "Missing children. Little girls mostly, between the ages of 6 and 10. All disappeared from small towns where Martin Cleary had either worked or been involved in joint investigations. Consulting work, training programs, interstate task forces." Wade's voice was heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. 17 cases over the past 25 years. 17 little girls who just vanished. The number hit Cole like a physical blow. 17 children, 17 families destroyed, 17 lives cut short by the monster he'd called mentor and friend. Could you prove it? Connect him to the other disappearances? Not conclusively. He was careful, never worked the same area twice in a row. Always had alibis, always made sure his involvement looked official and above board. Wade stopped walking and turned to face Cole directly. But Emma's case was different. He got sloppy because it was his hometown, because he thought he had perfect control over the investigation. They had reached the end of the tunnel, where it opened into what had once been a mine shaft. The air was colder here, carrying the scent of ancient rock and long-dead miners' dreams. Wade's flashlight revealed wooden support beams and rusted mining equipment, relics of Clearwater's gold rush past. "We need to get higher," Wade explained, pointing to a series of wooden ladders that led up through the shaft. "There's an opening about 50 feet up that connects to the surface. From there we can work our way down to the main road." Deputy Bradshaw looked up at the ladders with obvious apprehension. His shoulder wound was still bleeding, and he was already weak from blood loss. Climbing 50 feet of rickety wooden rungs would be a significant challenge for a healthy man, let alone someone in his condition. "I can make it," Bradshaw said, reading the doubt in their expressions. "Just give me a minute to rest." While they waited, Cole studied the church program again by flashlight. The more he looked at it, the more details emerged. Phone numbers written in the margins, probably contacts for other law enforcement officers who could provide alibis or misdirection. Times and locations that corresponded to Emma's known movements on the day she disappeared. Even a crude sketch of what looked like restraints or bonds. It was the work of a predator who had refined his methods over years of practice. A monster who had learned to use his badge and authority as tools for hunting children. "Wade," Cole said quietly, "when we get out of here, when we expose what Martin's done, it's not going to be easy. He's got friends in high places, political connections, other law enforcement officers who believe in him the way I did. I know." But we have evidence now. The program, the photograph, Tom's testimony about the planted trophies. And there are other victims out there, other families who deserve to know the truth about what happened to their children. Cole nodded, folding the program carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket next to Emma's photograph. Two pieces of evidence that could finally bring justice for a little girl who'd been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her. Above them, they could hear the distant sound of voices echoing through the mine shaft. Martin's men had found the tunnel entrance and were beginning their pursuit. "Time to go," Wade said grimly, checking his rifle one more time. "Tom, you ready for this?" Bradshaw pushed himself away from the rock wall where he'd been resting, his jaw set with determination despite his obvious pain. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's go get justice for Emma Hartwell." As they began climbing toward the surface, Cole found himself thinking about the little girl who'd trusted a man in uniform 20 years ago. Soon, her killer would face the consequences of his crimes. Soon, the truth would finally set them all free. They emerged from the mine shaft into the pre-dawn darkness, the mountain air sharp and clean after the musty confines of the underground passages. Wade had been right about the location. They were nearly half a mile from his cabin, hidden among the pine trees that covered the upper slopes of the mountain. But something was wrong. Even in the dim starlight, Cole could see tracks in the snow around the mine entrance. Fresh tracks, made by multiple people wearing heavy boots. "We're not the first ones here," he whispered to Wade. Before Wade could respond, powerful flashlight beams suddenly blazed to life around them, illuminating the clearing like stadium lights. They were surrounded. At least 6 men positioned in a rough circle, all armed with assault rifles and wearing the same tactical gear as the mercenaries from the cabin. "Drop your weapons." A voice commanded from the darkness behind the lights. Not one of the hired guns, Cole realized, but Martin Cleary himself. "You're surrounded with no place to run." Wade raised his rifle, but Cole caught his arm. "Don't! They'll cut us down before we can get off a shot." Reluctantly, Wade lowered his weapon and let it fall to the snow. Cole did the same with his father's revolver, the metal making a soft thud as it landed. "Smart choice," Martin said, stepping into the circle of light. He looked different now. Not the respected sheriff Cole remembered, but something colder and more predatory. The mask had finally come off completely. "Hands where we can see them, all 3 of you." As they raised their hands, one of the mercenaries moved forward to secure their weapons. But as he bent to pick up Wade's rifle, Boone suddenly darted out from behind a tree where he'd been hiding and clamped his jaws around the man's wrist. The mercenary screamed and tried to shake off the German shepherd, but Boone held on with the tenacity that had made him such an excellent tracking dog. In the confusion, Wade dove for his rifle while Cole rolled toward where his revolver had fallen. Gunfire erupted in the clearing, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning. Cole felt a bullet whine past his head as he grabbed his father's Colt and came up shooting. One of the mercenaries went down, clutching his leg and cursing, but there were too many of them and too much firepower. After a few seconds of chaos, Cole found himself face down in the snow with a rifle muzzle pressed against the back of his neck. "Enough!" Martin roared. "Cease fire!" The shooting stopped. Wade was also on the ground, blood seeping from a graze on his forehead where a bullet had come too close. Deputy Bradshaw had collapsed near the mine entrance. His shoulder wound reopened and bleeding freely. Only Boone was still fighting, growling and snapping at anyone who came near his fallen master. "Impressive," Martin said, surveying the scene with what might have been professional admiration. "I always said you were good in a crisis, Cole, but not quite good enough." He gestured to one of his men, who raised his rifle toward Boone. "No," Cole said quickly. "Leave the dog alone. You've got what you want." Martin considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough. I've always had a soft spot for animals. They're so much more honest than people, don't you think? When a dog wants to kill you, it doesn't pretend to be your friend first." Cole was hauled to his feet, his hands secured with plastic zip ties behind his back. The same was done to Wade and the semi-conscious Bradshaw. They were trapped, with no weapons and no way to escape. But as Martin approached, something in his jacket pocket caught the light. A small, familiar object that made Cole's blood freeze in his veins, a sheriff's department evidence log, old, yellowed with age, with handwriting that Cole recognized as his own. "I see you've noticed my little memento," Martin said, pulling out the logbook. "This has been quite useful over the years. Amazing how easy it is to alter reports when you're the one reviewing them before they go into the official files." He opened the logbook and held it up so Cole could see. Page after page of entries, all in Cole's careful handwriting, but many of them had been subtly altered. Words changed, times modified, entire sentences inserted that Cole had never written. October 16th, 1974, Martin read aloud from one of the pages. Deputy Cole Deacon reports, "Search the area north of town as suggested by tracker Wade Granger. Found no evidence of the missing child. Granger's claims about finding a campsite appear to be fabricated, possibly to justify his fee." Cole stared at the entry in shock. He remembered writing a report that day, but it had said the opposite, that Wade's evidence was compelling and should be investigated further. "You changed it," Cole said, understanding flooding through him. "You altered my reports." "Not just altered," Martin replied with evident pride. "Improved. Made them more accurate to the narrative we needed to establish." He flipped to another page. "Here's another good one. Deputy Deacon recommends closing the Emma Hartwell case due to lack of evidence and the unreliable nature of witness testimony. Your signature, your handwriting, your official recommendation." The sick feeling in Cole's stomach was growing worse. For 20 years, he'd believed that his own investigation had been inadequate, that his failures as a young deputy had contributed to Emma's killer going free. Now he was learning that his actual work had been systematically corrupted by the very man who was supposed to be mentoring him. "How?" Cole asked. "How did you manage to change so much without anyone noticing?" Martin chuckled, closing the logbook and tucking it back into his jacket. "You were so eager to please back then, so trusting when your supervisor suggested clarifications to your reports. I'd call you into my office, point out a few awkward phrases, suggest better ways to document your findings. You'd rewrite entire sections based on my recommendations." The memories came flooding back, late nights in Martin's office, going over reports line by line, Martin patiently explaining how to make their documentation more professional and legally sound. Cole had been grateful for the guidance, proud that his supervisor was taking such a personal interest in his development as a lawman. "The original pages would disappear, of course," Martin continued, "filed away somewhere safe while the revised versions went into the official record. Over time, even you forgot what you'd originally written. The human memory is remarkably malleable, especially when authority figures consistently reinforce a particular version of events." Wade was listening to this exchange with growing anger, blood from his head wound trickling down his face. "You son of a bitch. You made Cole blame himself for your crimes." "I made Cole into the lawman he became," Martin replied calmly. His guilt over the Hartwell case drove him to be better, to work harder, to never give up on a case. In a way, Emma's death created the most dedicated sheriff this county has ever had. The twisted logic of it made Cole want to vomit. 20 years of carrying guilt that wasn't his. 20 years of sleepless nights and failed relationships, and wondering what he could have done differently. All orchestrated by the man who had actually killed Emma Hartwell. "There's more," Martin said, clearly enjoying Cole's distress. "Would you like to know about the evidence that mysteriously disappeared from the case files over the years? The witness statements that got lost in bureaucratic shuffles? The leads that somehow never got properly followed up?" He reached into another pocket and produced a small key. "Storage unit in Denver. Climate-controlled, paid for in cash every month for the past 20 years. Contains every piece of evidence I removed from the Emma Hartwell case, plus documentation from my other projects. Cole thought about what Wade had told him in the tunnel. 17 missing children over 25 years. 17 families destroyed by this monster's appetites. "You kept trophies from all of them," Cole said. Not really a question. Memories, Martin corrected. Reminders of special times. The human mind can only hold so much detail. Physical objects help preserve the important moments. Deputy Bradshaw stirred, his eyes focusing with effort on the conversation around him. "How long?" he asked weakly. "How long have you been planning to frame me?" Martin looked down at the wounded young deputy with something that might have been sympathy. "About 6 months, ever since Cole started making noise about reopening the Hartwell case. I needed someone to take the fall, someone whose word wouldn't carry much weight against mine." He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a small duffel bag. From it, Martin withdrew several evidence bags containing items that Cole recognized as Emma's belongings. Her bracelet, a hair ribbon, a small locket that had been her grandmother's, these were planted in Tom's patrol car. "His locker, his home," Martin explained, "along with some interesting materials I downloaded onto his personal computer. When his body is found, along with yours, the investigation will reveal a disturbed young officer who became obsessed with cold cases, eventually snapping and killing the men who were getting too close to exposing his crimes. The plan was diabolically thorough. Tom Bradshaw would be posthumously branded as a child killer, while Martin Cleary would be remembered as the heroic sheriff who died trying to stop him. The real evidence would disappear, and Martin would vanish into whatever new identity he'd prepared for himself. Except for one problem, Cole said. "We're not the only ones who know the truth." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who else would that be?" Cole was bluffing, hoping to buy them more time, but Martin's reaction told him he'd hit on something. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the older man's features, the first crack in his confident facade. "You're wondering about Sarah, aren't you?" Cole pressed. "My ex-wife. You always wondered how much I told her about the cases I brought home, how much she knew about my suspicions regarding the Hartwell investigation. It was a shot in the dark." But Martin's expression confirmed that Cole had guessed correctly. Sarah had moved to Denver 5 years ago, but she'd kept in touch with some of their mutual friends in Clearwater. If something happened to Cole, she would ask questions. "Sarah doesn't know anything," Martin said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Doesn't she? What about the box of case files I kept in our bedroom closet? What about the late-night phone calls when I was working the case? The conversations she overheard?" Cole was making it up as he went along, but Martin's growing discomfort told him he was on the right track. "You never could account for every variable, could you, Martin? That's what's going to bring you down in the end." One of the mercenaries stepped forward, his rifle trained on Cole's chest. "Boss, we should wrap this up. Dawn's coming, and there might be hikers or hunters in the area." Martin nodded, seeming to shake off his momentary uncertainty. "You're right. Time to finish this." But as he reached for his sidearm, Boone suddenly exploded into action. The German shepherd had been lying still in the snow, appearing defeated. But now he launched himself at Martin with the fury of a wild animal protecting his pack. Martin went down hard, Boone's teeth closing around his gun arm. The pistol went flying into the darkness as man and dog rolled in the snow, Martin screaming in pain and terror. The mercenaries hesitated, afraid to shoot with their employer in the line of fire. In that moment of confusion, Wade managed to roll behind a fallen log, using his bound hands to fumble for a backup weapon he'd apparently hidden there earlier. Cole threw himself sideways as gunfire erupted again, the bullets whining over his head. He could see Wade's rifle muzzle flashing from behind the log, and at least one more mercenary went down, but there were still too many of them, and Cole was helpless with his hands tied behind his back. The battle was lost before it had really begun. Then he heard something that changed everything, the distant sound of helicopters approaching through the mountain passes, their rotors beating a rhythm of salvation against the morning sky. Martin managed to throw off Boone and stagger to his feet, blood streaming from his mauled arm. "What is that?" he demanded of his men. One of them lowered his rifle, pressing a hand to his earpiece. "Federal agents, sir. FBI and U.S. Marshals. They're surrounding the area." Martin's face went white. "That's impossible. There's no way they could know." "Actually, there is," came a new voice from the tree line. Sarah Deacon stepped into the clearing, flanked by 2 FBI agents with their weapons drawn. She looked older than Cole remembered, her blonde hair now streaked with grey, but her eyes were as sharp and determined as ever. "Hello, Martin," she said calmly. "I think it's time we had a talk about Emma Hartwell." The clearing erupted into chaos as Martin's mercenaries found themselves surrounded by federal agents. Helicopters thundered overhead, their spotlights turning night into harsh artificial day. Red laser dots danced across the chest of every man holding a weapon, and the air crackled with radio chatter as tactical teams coordinated their positions. "Federal agents," a voice boomed through a bullhorn. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground, now." Sarah moved carefully toward Cole, her FBI escort keeping their weapons trained on the mercenaries. In the harsh spotlight, Cole could see that she wore a Kevlar vest over her civilian clothes and carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Sarah," Cole said, hardly believing his eyes. "How did you—" "Later," she said, producing a knife and cutting his zip ties with quick, efficient movements. "Right now we need to secure this scene before someone gets killed." Around them, Martin's men were slowly laying down their weapons, clearly recognizing that resistance was futile. But Martin himself seemed frozen, staring at Sarah with an expression of disbelief and growing rage. "This is impossible," he said, his voice carrying the edge of panic for the first time. "There's no way you could have known. No way you could have connected me to Emma Hartwell's murder," Sarah finished calmly. "Or to the 17 other children you killed over the years. We've been building this case for months, Martin. Ever since Wade Granger contacted me through an intermediary and told me what he'd found in that storage facility in Denver." Cole looked between his ex-wife and Wade, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You two have been working together." Wade nodded, wincing as he pressed a hand to his head wound. "For almost a year. After I found that church program, I knew I needed help from someone in law enforcement, someone who wasn't connected to Martin's network of contacts." He glanced at Sarah. "Your ex-wife's FBI credentials came in handy." Sarah helped Deputy Bradshaw to his feet, supporting his weight as paramedics rushed forward with medical equipment. "Tom's gonna be fine," she assured Cole, "but he needs surgery to repair the damage to his shoulder." As Bradshaw was loaded onto a stretcher, he grabbed Cole's arm with his good hand. "The evidence," he said urgently. "The trophies he planted on me, we have them," Sarah said. "Everything he put in your car, your locker, your home. All of it's been catalogued and documented." She looked at Martin, who was now in handcuffs and being read his rights by a federal marshal. He made one crucial mistake. He used his own computer to download the illegal materials he planted on Tom's hard drive. Our cybercrime unit traced the digital fingerprints back to his home system. Cole watched as Martin was searched and his personal effects bagged as evidence. Among them was the Sheriff's Department evidence log that had documented 20 years of altered reports and manipulated investigations. "The storage unit in Denver," Cole said. "Did you find it?" 3 days ago. Martin Cleary kept meticulous records. Cole, photographs, personal items from the victims, detailed journals describing his methods and his victims' final moments. Sarah's voice was steady and professional, but Cole could see the horror in her eyes. 17 children over 25 years. Emma was just the beginning. As the crime scene was secured and the prisoners processed, Sarah led Cole aside for a private conversation. The helicopters had landed in a nearby meadow, and the harsh spotlights had been replaced by the gentler illumination of portable work lights. "I need to know," Cole said quietly. "How long have you suspected? How long have you known what Martin was?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching as FBI agents documented the scene and collected evidence. "Honestly, I think I suspected something was wrong from our first year of marriage. The way you'd come home from cases involving missing children, the nightmares you'd have about Emma Hartwell. But it wasn't until after our divorce that I started putting the pieces together." She pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on a nearby stump. "I need to take your statement, Cole. Everything you remember about the original investigation. about Martin's supervision of your work, about how you ended up in that cabin with Wade. For the next hour, Cole recounted the events of the past few days, starting with the bank robbery that had drawn him into Martin's trap. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting that he describe something in more detail. When he finished, she turned off the recorder and leaned back against a tree. "You know the hardest part about all this," she said. "Realizing that our marriage probably could have been saved if I'd understood what was really happening. You weren't carrying guilt about your own failures, Cole. You were carrying the weight of Martin's crimes without even knowing it." Cole thought about the years of distance that had grown between them, the arguments about having children, the way he'd pushed her away rather than risk failing another family the way he thought he'd failed Emma. "Would it have made a difference?" he asked, "if you'd known the truth?" "I don't know, but we would have faced it together instead of letting it drive us apart." She stood up, brushing snow off her jacket. "There's something else you need to know. About Wade." Cole looked across the clearing to where Wade was giving his own statement to federal agents. The outlaw looked older in the artificial light, worn down by years of carrying secrets and seeking justice that seemed impossible to achieve. "What about him?" "He's been living under federal protection for the past 2 years, ever since he first contacted the FBI about Martin's crimes. The whole fugitive thing, the warrants in 3 states, most of it was fabricated to give him cover while he gathered evidence." Cole stared at her in amazement. "You're telling me Wade's been working undercover for the FBI?" "Not exactly. More like a confidential informant with a very specific mission. He volunteered to go back to his criminal contacts, to use his reputation as an outlaw to access places and people that law enforcement couldn't reach." Sarah glanced at Wade again. "Do you know why he was really willing to risk everything to expose Martin?" Cole shook his head. "Because Emma Hartwell wasn't Martin's first victim in Clearwater. Wade had a younger sister, Lucy. She disappeared in 1971, 3 years before Emma. The case was never solved, and Wade's family fell apart afterward. His parents divorced, his father started drinking, and Wade himself went off the rails." The revelation hit Cole like a physical blow. Lucy Granger. He remembered the name now, remembered the missing person flyers and the search parties that had combed the mountains for weeks without finding any trace of her. Martin killed Wade's sister too. "We believe so. Lucy's disappearance follows the same pattern as Emma's and the others. Small town, festival or public gathering. A trusted authority figure available to provide assistance to a lost child." Sarah's expression was grim. "Wade spent the last 30 years blaming himself for not protecting his little sister. When he realized that the same man who'd killed Lucy had gone on to kill 17 other children, he couldn't live with staying silent anymore." Cole understood now why Wade had been so determined to expose the truth, why he'd been willing to risk everything to bring Martin to justice. It wasn't just about Emma Hartwell. It was about his own sister, his own family, his own decades of guilt and self-blame. "There's going to be a lot of media attention," Sarah continued. 17 murdered children, a corrupt sheriff, a federal investigation that spans multiple states. You're going to be at the center of it, whether you want to be or not." Cole thought about returning to Clearwater, about facing the townspeople who'd trusted Martin Cleary with their safety and their children's lives, about rebuilding a sheriff's department that had been compromised for decades by a predator hiding behind a badge. "What happens to me now?" he asked. "I can't go back to wearing a star, not after this. How do I look people in the eye knowing that I worked for a child killer for 20 years? "The same way Wade lived with carrying the guilt of his sister's death," Sarah said simply. "One day at a time, focusing on the good you can do instead of the evil you couldn't prevent." In the distance, they could hear the sound of more helicopters arriving, probably media crews who'd gotten wind of the massive federal operation in the mountains. Soon the whole world would know about Martin Cleary's crimes, about the children whose deaths he'd hidden behind a facade of professional competence and community respect. But for now, In this moment, Emma Hartwell finally had her justice. And Cole Deacon finally knew the truth about the case that had defined his life for 20 years. The weight of that truth was both crushing and liberating. Like a burden he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The media circus began at dawn. News vans lined the mountain road leading to the crime scene, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Reporters stood in the early morning light, speaking earnestly into cameras, while helicopters circled overhead like vultures drawn to carrion. Cole watched the spectacle from inside the FBI's mobile command unit, a converted RV that served as their field headquarters. Through the tinted windows, he could see Sarah coordinating with federal agents and local law enforcement, her professional demeanor masking what he knew must be exhaustion after a sleepless night. Wade sat across from him, a white bandage covering the graze on his forehead. His hands were cuffed to the table, not because he was under arrest, Sarah had explained, but because his cover as a wanted fugitive had to be maintained until the investigation was complete. 17 children, Wade said quietly, staring at the photographs spread across the table. School pictures of smiling kids who would never grow up, never graduate, never have families of their own. 17 families destroyed because I wasn't smart enough to figure out what he was 20 years ago. Stop, Cole said firmly. We both know that's not true. Martin Cleary was careful, methodical. He spent decades perfecting his methods, learning how to manipulate investigations and cover his tracks. A 30-year-old tracker, no matter how skilled, couldn't have exposed him back then. Wade picked up one of the photographs, a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Jessica Morrison, age 7, disappeared from a church picnic in Grand Junction in 1987. Martin was consulting on a multi-jurisdictional task force there. He set that picture aside and picked up another. Katie Sullivan, age 9, vanished from a school carnival in Durango in 1993. Martin was providing training seminars for rural law enforcement agencies. The pattern was sickeningly consistent. Martin had used his reputation and professional connections to gain access to communities throughout Colorado and neighboring states. Always the helpful expert. Always the dedicated lawman willing to share his expertise with smaller departments that lacked resources and experience, and always, within weeks of his arrival, a child would disappear. The storage unit in Denver, Cole said. Sarah mentioned journals. Did he document everything? Wade nodded grimly. Every detail. Methods, timelines, victim selection criteria. He treated it like a professional development exercise, analyzing what worked and what didn't. Refining his approach with each case, he opened a manila folder and pulled out photocopied pages covered with Martin's precise handwriting. Even reading upside down, Cole could see references to Emma's case, notes about the festival environment and the effectiveness of using uniform authority to gain a child's trust. There's something else, Wade continued. Something Sarah hasn't told you yet because she's not sure how you'll handle it. Cole looked up from the journal pages. What? Martin didn't work alone on all of them. Some of the later cases, especially after he became sheriff, he had help. Other people in law enforcement who were either corrupted or blackmailed into assisting him. The implications were staggering. A network of corrupt officials, all compromised by their connection to Martin Cleary's crimes. How many police departments, sheriff's offices, and federal agencies had been infiltrated? Who? Cole asked. Before Wade could answer, the command unit's door opened and Sarah stepped inside. She looked haggard, her usually perfect FBI appearance rumpled from the long night. Behind her came a man Cole didn't recognize. Tall, lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in law enforcement. Cole. This is Assistant Director Frank Morrison, Sarah said. He's running the task force investigating Martin's crimes. Cole stood and shook hands with the federal agent, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. Morrison had the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Sheriff Deacon, Morrison said, settling into a chair across from Cole. I understand this situation is particularly difficult for you, given your personal relationship with the suspect. Martin Cleary is not a suspect, Cole replied evenly. He's a confessed child killer who spent 20 years manipulating my investigations and destroying evidence. The only question now is how many other people were involved. Morrison nodded approvingly. Good, I was hoping you'd see it that way. Because we're going to need your help to identify the full extent of his network. He opened his briefcase and pulled out several thick files. Over the past 18 months, we've been building cases against 12 individuals in 6 states who we believe assisted Martin Cleary in covering up his crimes. Some were blackmailed, others were bribed, and a few seem to have been willing participants who shared his interests. Cole felt sick thinking about it. Law enforcement officers sworn to protect children, instead helping a predator hunt them. What do you need from me? He asked. Everything you can remember about the cases you worked with Martin over the years. Every time he steered you away from a particular lead, every witness who became suddenly uncooperative, every piece of evidence that went missing. Morrison leaned forward. You were his unwitting cover for 2 decades, Sheriff. Your reputation for integrity and dedication helped legitimize his operations. But that also means you saw things, noticed patterns that you might not have recognized at the time. Sarah sat down next to Cole, pulling out her own notebook. We'll start with Emma's case and work forward chronologically. Every interaction you had with Martin during that investigation, every suggestion he made, every revision to your reports. For the next 3 hours, Cole relived 20 years of professional memories, analyzing them through the lens of newfound knowledge about Martin's true nature. It was exhausting and nauseating work, recognizing how thoroughly he'd been manipulated and used, but gradually patterns emerged. Names of other officers who'd been present during key moments, jurisdictions where evidence had been lost or witnesses had recanted their statements. A web of corruption that extended far beyond Clearwater County. There's something else, Cole said, as they reached the end of his formal debriefing. There's something that just occurred to me. Martin always insisted on personally reviewing the case files for unsolved crimes involving children. Said it was important for departmental morale that the sheriff stay personally involved in the most serious cases. Morrison and Sarah exchanged glances. How many files would he have had access to over the years? Morrison asked. All of them. Every missing child case in our jurisdiction for the past 2 decades. Cole paused, a terrible thought occurring to him. And he was part of the regional task force that coordinated with other agencies on multi-jurisdictional cases. He would have seen files from departments all over the state. Jesus, Wade said quietly. He was shopping, using official channels to identify potential victims and scope out law enforcement capabilities in different areas. Sarah was already on her phone, calling someone at FBI headquarters. We need a complete audit of every case file Martin Cleary accessed through the regional database, she said into the phone. Priority 1, no delays. As she coordinated the expanded investigation, Cole found himself staring at the photographs of Martin's victims. 17 children whose deaths could have been prevented if he'd been smart enough, observant enough, suspicious enough to see through his mentor's carefully constructed facade. Stop doing that to yourself, Wade said, recognizing the expression on Cole's face. I've been carrying that guilt for 30 years, and it doesn't help anyone. The only thing that matters now is making sure justice is served and that Martin never hurts another child. Cole looked up at the man he'd once chased through a blizzard, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who'd also been carrying undeserved guilt for decades. What happens to us after this? When the trials are over and the media moves on to the next story? We do what survivors do, Wade replied simply. We keep living. We try to make the world a little safer for the children who are still alive. And we remember the ones who aren't, so they know they weren't forgotten, outside the command unit. Cole could hear the sounds of the crime scene being processed, evidence being catalogued, witnesses being interviewed. the machinery of justice grinding slowly but inexorably forward. For the first time in 20 years, Emma Hartwell's killer was in custody. The truth was finally coming to light, no matter how painful or far-reaching that truth might be. But Cole knew the hardest part was still ahead, facing the families of Martin's victims, confronting his own role in enabling the crimes, and finding a way to rebuild his life around the knowledge that everything he'd believed about justice and trust had been built on lies. In his jacket pocket, Emma's photograph seemed to weigh heavier than it had before, not with guilt now, but with responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that her death, and the deaths of all Martin's victims, would finally serve a purpose beyond one monster's twisted satisfaction. Justice had been a long time coming, but it was here at last. The confrontation came at sunset. Cole had thought it was over, Martin in custody, the evidence secured, the investigation expanding to encompass the full scope of his crimes. But as the FBI prepared to transport their prisoner to Denver for formal arraignment, Martin Cleary made one final play. It started when Deputy Tom Bradshaw, heavily sedated but conscious after his surgery, asked to speak privately with Cole. The young officer had been airlifted to Denver General that morning, and Cole had driven down to check on him before the media attention made such visits impossible. "There's something I need to tell you," Bradshaw said, his voice weak but urgent. "About the evidence Martin planted on me. It wasn't just Emma's things." Cole leaned closer to the hospital bed. "What do you mean?" "There were other items. Jewelry, hair ribbons, small toys, things that belonged to other children." Bradshaw's eyes were haunted. "I found them this morning when the FBI was searching my apartment, hidden in places I'd never looked, never thought to look." The implication was clear. Martin had been planting evidence for months, perhaps years, preparing Tom Bradshaw to take the fall, not just for Emma's murder, but for all 17 children. "Did you tell the FBI?" "I tried to. But when they went to my apartment to collect the items, they were gone. Someone had been there before them, cleaned out everything." Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Who else had access to your apartment?" "Martin had spare keys to all his deputies' homes. Department policy, in case of emergencies." Bradshaw gripped Cole's arm with surprising strength. "But that's not the worst part. Sheriff Cleary asked to see me this morning. Said he needed to clear up some details about what happened in the mountains." "The feds let him visit you?" "He's still the elected sheriff, at least until the formal charges are filed. They couldn't deny him access to one of his injured deputies." Bradshaw's voice dropped to a whisper. "He threatened my wife and daughter, Cole. Said that even if he went down, his associates would make sure my family paid for my betrayal." Cole's blood ran cold. Martin's network of corrupt contacts wasn't just about covering up past crimes. It was insurance against future exposure. "Where are Jenny and the baby now?" "Safe house, I hope. The FBI moved them this afternoon, after I told them about Martin's visit." Bradshaw closed his eyes, exhaustion and pain overwhelming him. "But you know him better than anyone, Cole. If Martin wants to hurt someone, can a safe house really stop him?" Cole didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. Martin Cleary had spent decades building relationships within law enforcement, learning how federal protection programs worked, identifying their weaknesses. If he wanted to reach Tom Bradshaw's family, he would find a way. That evening, as Cole drove back toward Clearwater through mountain passes now crawling with media vehicles and federal agents, his phone rang. Sarah's number appeared on the display. "Cole, where are you?" Her voice was tight with stress. "About an hour outside town." "Why? What's wrong?" "Martin escaped during transport to Denver. The federal marshal's vehicle was ambushed on Highway 285, near Fairplay. 2 agents are in critical condition." Cole pulled over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. "How is that possible?" "Inside help. Someone with access to the transport schedule and route information. We're looking at everyone who had knowledge of the operation. But right now, Martin Cleary is in the wind with at least 2 armed accomplices. The full scope of Martin's corruption network was becoming terrifyingly clear. Not just local deputies and rural sheriffs, but federal agents, marshals, people with security clearances and access to witness protection protocols. "There's more," Sarah continued. "We intercepted radio chatter suggesting Martin is heading back toward Clearwater. He's not running, Cole. He's coming home to finish what he started." Cole understood with horrible clarity what that meant. Martin knew his empire was crumbling, knew that his network of corrupt contacts was being exposed and dismantled. But instead of fleeing to some non-extradition country with a new identity, he was choosing to make his final stand in the place where it all began, in the town where he'd killed Emma Hartwell 20 years ago. "He's going after the witnesses," Cole said. "Tom's family, Wade, anyone who can testify against him. That's our assessment, too. We've got tactical teams moving into the area, but Martin knows that country better than anyone. He's got safe houses, weapons caches, contacts who will help him stay hidden." Cole started his truck and pulled back onto the highway, pushing the speedometer past safe limits for the winding mountain road. "What about Wade?" "Missing. He was supposed to report to our field office in Denver this afternoon for additional debriefing. Never showed up. We think Martin's people got to him first." The thought of Wade in Martin's hands was almost unbearable. After 30 years of carrying guilt over his sister's death, to be captured by her killer just as justice finally seemed within reach. "Cole, you need to stay away from Clearwater," Sarah said urgently. "Martin's primary targets are the people who exposed him. You're at the top of that list." But Cole was already formulating a plan, thinking about places Martin might go, people he might contact. 20 years of working with the man, of learning his methods and habits, had to count for something. "I know him, Sarah. I know how he thinks, where he'd hide." "You need me on this?" "Absolutely not. You're emotionally compromised. You're not law enforcement anymore. And Martin has proven he's willing to kill anyone who gets in his way." Cole thought about Emma Hartwell, about Wade's sister Lucy, about 17 other children whose deaths demanded justice, about Tom Bradshaw's wife and baby daughter. Innocent people caught in the crossfire of a madman's desperation. "I'm sorry," he said, and hung up the phone. Boone was waiting in the truck's passenger seat, alert and ready, despite the chaos of the past 24 hours. The German shepherd seemed to sense that their work wasn't finished, that the hunt was about to begin again. Cole checked his father's service revolver, making sure it was fully loaded. 6 bullets against a man who'd spent decades preparing for this moment, who had resources and allies that Cole could only guess at. But Cole had something Martin didn't, the moral certainty that came from finally knowing the truth. No more doubt, no more guilt over imagined failures. Just the clean purpose of stopping a monster before he could hurt anyone else. The phone rang again, Sarah trying to call him back. Cole turned it off and drove toward Clearwater, toward whatever final confrontation awaited him there. Behind him, the last light of day painted the mountains red as blood, and ahead lay the darkness where justice would finally be served. As he crested the hill overlooking his hometown, Cole could see lights moving in the forest, search teams probably, or Martin's accomplices positioning themselves for the battle to come. Either way, it was going to be a long night. He reached over and scratched Boone behind the ears. "Ready for one more hunt, boy?" The dog's answering whine carried all the loyalty and determination that had sustained them through 20 years of partnership. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they would face it together. In the distance, the lights of Clearwater glittered like stars fallen to earth, a peaceful town that had no idea it was about to become the final battleground in a war that had been raging in secret for decades. Cole Deacon drove toward home, toward justice, toward an ending that had been 20 years in the making. Spring came to Clearwater 3 months later, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed impossibly vibrant after the long, dark winter. The aspens were budding along the mountainsides, and the creek that ran through town was running high with snowmelt, carrying with it the promise of renewal and new beginnings. Cole stood in the town cemetery, morning sunlight filtering through the pine trees as he placed fresh flowers on Emma Hartwell's grave. The new memorial stone was simple but dignified, carved from local granite with an inscription that told the truth at last. Emma Grace Hartwell, October 7th, 1966, October 18th, 1974. Beloved daughter. Her killer has been brought to justice. She will not be forgotten. The wooden horse sat beside the flowers, its painted eyes still bright, despite 20 years of hiding in darkness. Cole had asked Emma's parents if they wanted it back, but they'd insisted it belonged here, with their daughter. Thought I might find you here. Cole turned to see Wade approaching through the cemetery gates. The man looked different in civilian clothes, more like the tracker he'd once been, less like the outlaw he'd pretended to be for so many years. The Federal Witness Protection Program had given him a new identity, a new life, but he'd chosen to stay in Colorado, working as a wilderness guide for a company that specialized in helping law enforcement agencies with search and rescue operations. How did it go in Denver? Cole asked. Wade's testimony in Martin Cleary's trial had been crucial, his first-hand account of the confession and the planted evidence helping to secure convictions on all 17 murder charges. Martin was now on death row at the Colorado State Penitentiary, his appeals exhausted and his network of corrupt accomplices either in prison or under federal investigation. Sentencing hearing for Deputy Mills, Wade replied, settling beside Cole on the stone bench that faced Emma's grave. 20 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. He'll serve every day of it. Dale Mills had been Martin's inside man at the sheriff's department, the deputy who'd helped alter evidence and intimidate witnesses for over a decade. His conviction had been the last piece of the puzzle, the final thread in unraveling Martin's web of corruption. Any word on the families? Cole asked. The Hartwell Foundation approved another 6 scholarships this year. Families of missing children, helping them pay for college or trade school. Wade smiled slightly. Emma's parents wanted to make sure something good came out of all this horror. The foundation had been Emma's mother's idea, a way to honor her daughter's memory while helping other families who'd suffered similar losses. Cole had been surprised to learn he'd been named to the board of directors, along with Sarah and several other law enforcement professionals who specialized in crimes against children. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning sun climb higher over the mountains. The town below them was slowly coming back to life after the trauma of Martin's crimes. New leadership at the sheriff's department, federal oversight of local law enforcement, and a renewed commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of the community. You ever think about what might have been different? Wade asked. If we'd figured it out sooner, if we'd been smarter 20 years ago? Cole considered the question he'd asked himself countless times over the past months. Every day. But I've learned something about guilt and responsibility. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is different. He thought about Tom Bradshaw, now fully recovered and serving as the interim sheriff while the county searched for a permanent replacement. About Jenny Bradshaw and her daughter, safe in their new life thanks to federal protection programs that actually worked when they weren't compromised by corruption. About the 17 families who finally had answers, closure, and the knowledge that their children's killer would never hurt anyone else. Sarah asked me to give you something, Wade said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. She would have come herself, but the Bureau has her working a new case in Utah. Cole opened the envelope and found a photograph of Sarah receiving a commendation from the FBI director, recognition for her role in exposing Martin's crimes and dismantling his network of corrupt contacts. She looked proud and professional in her dress uniform, but Cole could see the sadness in her eyes, the weight of all those lost children. All those years when the truth had been hidden. She's doing good work, Cole said, tucking the photo into his wallet next to the image of Emma that he'd carried for so long. So are you. Cole looked up, questioning. The private investigation firm, Wade explained. I heard you're specializing in cold cases involving missing children. Pro bono work for families who can't afford to hire professional help. It was true. Cole had used his settlement from the wrongful termination lawsuit against Clearwater County to start his own agency. focusing on the cases that larger firms wouldn't take because they weren't profitable enough. Missing children, runaway teenagers, families desperate for answers that law enforcement couldn't provide. "It's what Emma would have wanted," Cole said simply. They rose from the bench and walked together toward the cemetery entrance. Boone was waiting by Cole's truck, grey around the muzzle now, but still alert and ready for whatever adventure might come next. The dog had acquired a companion over the winter, a young German shepherd puppy that Cole had rescued from the animal shelter. A female they'd named Grace, in honor of Emma's middle name. "You heading back up to the mountains?" Cole asked as they reached their vehicles. Wade nodded toward the peaks that surrounded Clearwater, like protective guardians. "Got a search and rescue training exercise this afternoon. Teaching federal agents how to track fugitives in wilderness terrain," he grinned. "Ironic, considering my own history as a fugitive. Not anymore. Now you're one of the good guys. We both are. Finally." They shook hands in the morning sunlight. Two men who'd found their way back to the light after decades of carrying darkness they hadn't deserved. As Wade drove away, Cole took one last look at Emma's grave, at the wooden horse that kept watch over her final resting place. "Justice served," he said quietly, the words carrying on the mountain breeze like a promise kept. Then he climbed into his truck, whistled for his dogs, and drove toward town where a new case was waiting, another missing child, another family desperate for answers, another chance to make sure that evil didn't triumph over innocence. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, Colorado, illuminating a community that had faced its darkest secrets and chosen to move forward into the light. Somewhere in the cemetery behind him, Emma Hartwell rested at peace, knowing that her story had finally been told and her killer brought to justice. And in the valley below, life continued with all its possibilities and promises, watched over by those who'd learned that the price of safety was eternal vigilance, and that justice might be delayed but would never be denied to those who refused to give up the fight. The wooden horse caught the sunlight one last time, its painted eyes reflecting the sky, before settling back into the quiet companionship of wildflowers and mountain air. Emma was home at last, and all was well in the world she'd left too soon, but would never truly leave behind. Her memory lived on in the work of those who'd loved her, in the children who were safer because her story had been told, and in the promise that no other little girl would suffer as she had suffered. Not while there were still people willing to stand up for the innocent and fight for the truth. No matter how long it took or how much it cost, the hunt was over. Justice had won, and spring had come to the mountains once more, bringing with it the eternal hope that tomorrow would be better than today, and that love would always triumph over evil in the end.